All right, folks, let's see. Welcome to another episode of Sociology Unmasked. I am David Burley. I am here with my very, very good friend, Stephan Namisnak, aka the Colonel, public intellectual, and disability activist. And we spend many a Friday whiling away the afternoon over coffee and politics and other worldly events. So we'll jump into it today. Uh, we figured it is timely. We need to talk about it. We all need to be talking about it. The Russian invasion of Ukraine. So we're talking Ruskies here. And so let's, I guess, Stephan, let's just kind of start off with, where we are today. Today is what, Friday, March?
We are 3 weeks in to the war of aggression being waged by the Russian Federation against my ancestral fatherland, Ukraine. And that is 3 weeks in with over 3 million refugees, of whom at least half are children, as well as an equal number of internally displaced people in Ukraine due to the Russian onslaught. And I know, today is an exciting day because you yourself are in the market for a house. There are a lot of Ukrainians without homes now. And so at the outset of our discussion, rather than at the end, for people who are listening and who are galvanized to action, if not by our conversation, then at least by events, who want to take action in some way, I'd suggest that people take a look at ukrainenow.org. That's ukrainenow.org, where there are various links and means for people to take direct action by volunteering their time, but also making donations for humanitarian aid for Ukraine and for Ukrainians.
I'm sorry, ukrainenow.org.
Ukrainenow.org.
Just put it in the chat so people can see it.
And there is also rescue.org, where financial contributions can be made for humanitarian assistance to refugees. And rescue.org is assisting refugees not only from the war in Ukraine, but also it's a good reminder that there are ongoing wars in Yemen, in Syria. There are still millions of people in flight from Afghanistan, and all of these people are in need of assistance. For people who want to take more direct action, writing to our congressmen and senators here in the United States to petition for the federal government to allow in more refugees, including refugees from Ukraine, will make a world of difference in people's lives as they get to a place where they can then turn around and return home to rebuild in the future, because the nation of Ukraine is being devastated as we speak, and people need to get out so they can then get back and rebuild down the road.
Indeed, because President Biden has not, we have not formally announced, the United States has not formally announced that we'll accept any refugees yet, right? As of now, it's just sort of like patting old Europe on the back and saying, good job, keep at it.
Right. And I mean, the countries adjacent to Ukraine need assistance. Poland has taken the greatest number of refugees, and that's a situation that will ultimately be unsustainable for the Poles long term. Of course, many of the countries neighboring Ukraine, Slovakia, Romania, Poland, they are sympathetic to the situation. No one more aware than, say, the Lithuanians of the very real threat of Russian imperialism, because these are all nations that have lived with this throughout their existence. it's an ongoing situation historically, and certainly for the past 20 years.
Yeah. So, very, very important. And people, especially for young people who think that, writing your congressman does not make a difference, they listen. You can believe that, right? So, and it's very easy, right? Because all you have to do is look them up on the old Google search, right? And it'll take in, a couple of clicks and you're at their email address. And, they might not look at it directly, but their staffers look at it. They tally those numbers. Those messages get in, believe me.
Yeah, I think our public representatives need to hear from their constituents, because they need to be told what it is we elected them to office to do, what it is we're concerned about. And I think right now, for most Americans watching the news, this is an area of concern. People are aghast, and a way in which we can make a difference in people's lives and a difference in the world is through, our political system, our representative democracy, actually making our voices heard and letting people know that this is something we want action taken on. The president and the Congress, in making available military assistance to Ukraine this past week, have, taken steps in that direction, because this is a war, and war requires armaments, and Ukraine has been at a great disadvantage in defending itself from the Russian invasion. So the aid that is going towards Ukraine now, the military aid, will be helpful, but amongst the consequences of any military action are, the humanitarian costs, the civilian price that is being paid. And because the war that is being waged by Russia is tantamount to total war, which is bent upon the destruction of a nation and a people, the destruction of the denial of a culture, the denial of a history, and the obliteration of the present by using their munitions to target, civilians, housing, hospitals, museums, theaters, refuges. All of that is going to lead to, people needing a place to go. And I think while we have found within our defense budget, within our national budget, within our pockets, ways to aid Ukraine as a nation in defending itself, I think as Americans, we also have in our hearts to aid people in flight, seeking refuge. And so reminding our senators and our representatives of that is a timely thing to do. And for people who wish to open up their own homes, housing refugees is something that, you can do at this time. And you can make a very real difference in the lives of people.
Yeah, totally. And good point of also with the rescue.org, lest we forget the ongoing humanitarian crises in Afghanistan, Yemen, and Syria. But let's take stock, if you will, of how we got here. So let's dive into a little bit of that. What's your perspective here?
Sure.
How we got here?
Sure. I mean, my perspective is informed by being Ukrainian American, and how I got here was my grandparents emigrating from Western Ukraine to the United States a little over 100 years ago, prior to the First World War, when things were coming unhinged in Europe, as well as in the Russian Empire, and the Russian Empire, wreaking havoc in Europe as well, leading to the First World War in part. My grandparents emigrated to the United States around 1910. And so I grew up as a third generation American, very aware of the American immigrant experience, and interested in knowing about my history, the history of my family.
Stephan, I never knew. All the years we've been friends and talking, I did not know about your Ukrainian history, or to such depth, I might say.
Yeah, and as somebody growing up knowing that they're Ukrainian American, like any of us, whatever our family background, I think particularly in the United States, where we are, all of different backgrounds, the majesty of our nation, you want to know who you are, where you're from. And for me, in growing up, learning about my heritage, who we were was Ukrainian. Where we were from got complicated within history, because when I would ask my dad, he would say, well, we're Ukrainian, you're Ukrainian American. Your grandparents were from Austro-Hungary. So an empire, a nation, no longer on the maps. Right? Lost to history.
That's right.
But it was very specific that is where my grandparents, Ava and Yurko, had emigrated from, was Austro-Hungary. It was, in Western Ukraine, Galicia, Transcarpathia. It was at that time when they emigrated, in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so specifically, what I was being told was it was not Russia, and of course, at that time, part of Ukraine was in the Russian Empire, but it was not all in the Russian Empire. And it was very clear that the message was, it was Ukraine, it was not Russia. When you look at like family identity, ethnic identity, and ultimately national identity, as a Ukrainian American, the things that are there, as for all of us, there's many things that are important. There are many constituent elements in making that identity. Language is important. I don't speak Ukrainian other than holiday greetings, unfortunately. My father did. He understood Ukrainian. He didn't really speak it much. My grandfather pretty much only spoke Ukrainian, never really learned a whole lot of English. The significance of the language was that it was the Ukrainian language, which for 2/3 of Ukrainians today in modern Ukraine is their first language. You've got 1/3 of Ukrainians for whom Russian is their first language. And as in many former Soviet republics, Russian is a second language for just about everybody. But that the language was Ukrainian, and that was not, quote, Little Russian. It was a distinct and separate language, linguistically related, but its own language, and therefore contributing to a unique identity. So language is important. Religion is important. The faith is huge in Ukraine, as being given testimony in almost all news coverage of the war, where you see churches are involved, as they often are in wars, houses of worship, people of faith, often beleaguered in wartime. But the faith of Ukrainians is now being put to the test. For me, as an Ukrainian Catholic, an Eastern Rite Catholic, I'm in a very specific religious tradition, which is very similar to the Orthodox Church, but it's not. And it's not because Ukrainian Catholics did not want to be under Moscow. They did not want to be part of the Russian Orthodoxy. So they became part of the Uniate Church, and their affiliated with Rome and Roman Catholicism, but in the Eastern rite of the religion, the language, faith, I mean, the most Ukrainian thing of all perhaps is bread, it being the breadbasket of Europe. And we're seeing that now play out with commodities markets worldwide, where Ukrainian as well as Russian wheat are being taken off of that global market and causing a lot of problems for a lot of people around the globe. In a few weeks for Easter, my wife will be baking Pascha, the traditional Ukrainian Easter bread. All of these things add up to what it meant to understand who I was and where my family was from. But one of the things that runs through all of them is also who we are not, and that is that we're not Russian. We don't speak Russian, we're not under the patriarchate of, Moscow and the Orthodox Church. We are specifically, not Russian. So it is in some ways, in that regard, identity is defined by, negation, who you're not. And the reason for that is one that, again, many of those countries around Russia can understand, that Tsarist imperialism, Soviet imperialism, and now 20 years of Putin's imperialism have put people under threat. And in the case of Ukraine, a whole culture under threat, a whole nation very much under threat now. So that was the understanding in terms of identity, and the awareness that this was always a possibility. This kind of suzerainty from your neighbors was always, one was always in peril, is now being played out. And it doesn't come as a surprise to Ukrainians. Obviously, it's no surprise at all.
So let me just jump in there, right? And I think that was good, especially sort of the segue into, the breadbasket of Europe and the wheat, the commodity of wheat being taken off the market, and how that's going to affect individual lives. Geopolitically, in the past year or several years, how did we get to this invasion, right? How did we get to this point?
Yeah, I think looking at the sociology of war and how societies prepare for war and how they prosecute war, that in Putin's Russia, there has been a orientation towards war in the interest of reconstituting what Putin views as the rightful Russian Empire, that was the Soviet Empire that he saw fall apart, and harkens back to the Tsarist Empire, in which he now serves as the current Tsar, just as Stalin did in the Soviet era, and before that, the actual Tsars. And like all of the Tsars, Putin has no concern with the welfare of people, meaning his own people, the Russian people, or others.
Yeah, just a little bit of a context here for any younger people who may be listening. The Tsarist imperialism, CZAR, was pre-communist revolution, and those rulers were monarchs, right, of Russia, the same as we might say the king and queen of England and in many other European countries. It was just what they were called. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, not at all. But without a constitutional monarchy, like one has in England, and has had, for centuries, the Tsar is an absolute ruler, an emperor, of Imperial Russia.
Probably more apt to say emperor. Yeah.
Yeah, and with that, how did we get here, and how does that connect to the sociology of war? I'm thinking about the wars which have been waged by Putin's Russia, beginning with his ascendancy to power, and that was the Chechen War within the Russian Federation, which Putin used to successfully consolidate his power when he became, president of Russia back at the turn of this century. And he used that Chechen separatist war to, again, consolidate his position as president of the Russian Federation. And he waged a war of annihilation in Chechnya, where he laid waste to the region so as to secure it as part of the Russian Federation. And that was an, unremitting war. And I think what he took away from it was that war served him well in that regard. And it didn't necessarily serve Chechnya well, which isn't to say that, that the Chechen separatists would have. It's not taking a stand on that, only to say that Chechnya was economically put far back after the end of that war because of the incredible destruction that was visited upon the region. Putin went on to, every time there was trouble for the Russian national team at the Olympics, to wage war elsewhere. So invading a former Soviet republic in Georgia back in 2008, he, makes these irredentist claims to territory beyond the agreed upon borders of the Russian nation, and takes over the land of his neighbors, all of whom were former Soviet republics, and so had been in the Soviet Empire and ruled from Moscow. And in the case of the Georgians, they had achieved independence with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. There are, like the Ukrainians, like the Lithuanians, a different people. And in 2008, Putin took part of Georgia with a stirring up separatist movement within Georgia and then controlling it henceforth, and successfully. Subsequent to that, in 2014, Putin invades Crimea, and then following that, the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. And in taking Crimea from Ukraine, despite the fact that in the 90s, Russia, the United States, the UK all made security guarantees to Ukraine in order for Ukraine to give up the world's third largest nuclear arsenal, saying that their borders would be respected and protected, and that all of these nations, though not allied with Ukraine through a bloc like NATO, they were nevertheless going to be guarantees for their security. And when that security was violated, Crimea was invaded by Russia. Yeah. The world didn't do anything.
Yeah.
We let it pass.
Let's stay there for a second, right? Because I think that's really, really interesting, right? Because this goes back to 2014, and all of that is in the context of the 1980s, which is all in the context of before, of course. But let's stick with that. So yeah, Ukraine had the world's third largest stockpile of nuclear weapons because it had been part of the Soviet Empire, right? The Soviet Union. Right, and so 89, 91, right? The dissolution of 89, the wall comes down in Berlin. 91, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Ukraine gains its independence. Its economy, like that of Russia's, is in shambles, right? Mm-hmm. And so it's looking, it doesn't, with all things being equal, if it wasn't in, such shambles. It probably would have been, they would have liked to hold on to those as a security blanket, right?
Yeah,
Right.
I think actually,
Against Russia.
if memory serves, Ukraine very much wanted to hold on to them. It was a difficult decision and one made with a lot of international pressure
Right.
to let go. And
Right.
in the
And,
chaos of the time,
the United States, I think James Baker told then George H. Bush, no other foreign policy demands your time, is more important than this, right? All these states that are really in dire straits that have now gone left the Soviet Union, and they all have nuclear weapons, and we don't know where all this is headed, right? That this really has to be the biggest thing on your agenda, foreign policy wise, right? So James Baker, convinces him of this, and and the whole West, Europe, Western Europe, and the United States and Canada convinces Ukraine, hey, look, we'll come to your economic aid and help you build up your economy, right? So you don't have people going hungry, right? And get some real economic infrastructure going, but you're going to have to give up those nukes, right?
and moreover, I think guaranteeing territorial sovereignty.
Yes.
Which can't be
Yes.
gainsaid when you've just broken away, from the Soviet Union, and you've done that in pursuit of your independence. And it took years, right? It begins in the Bush administration, continues in the Clinton administration. It took years for Ukraine to surrender those nuclear weapons, and that then set the stage for START treaty and moves towards limitation of nuclear weapons. And it was manifestly a good thing at a time of great chaos in all of these countries. The risk of proliferation was real, that nuclear arms could be sold off, people might not be keeping track of them, all of the risks that we still have with nuclear weapons. And recently I think our attention, because of this war, has been refocused on this, as it's been talked about as, a prelude to World War III, which it very much could be if there is escalation of the war, if there is expansion of the war. And that is a very real concern. A few weeks ago, back before during the Olympics, and as we were building up to this war, because the buildup for this invasion has been going on for months. 150,000 Russian soldiers weren't mobilized overnight. This was not a quick response. This was a long-term military buildup going over the course of the past year. And as we moved to that and the war, we moved towards the actual invasion, we heard a lot out of President Biden about it, sounding the drum, letting people know that this is coming. This is what the intelligence says. And indeed, that is how, in this scenario, it turned out. During that time, there was
Excuse me, you mean he actually listened to his intelligence?
Well, and the intelligence, was accurate, because it isn't always. It isn't
Right.
always.
Right.
But in this
No,
case,
it's not.
it was.
We
At
saw
the same
that
time,
in the Iraqi invasion, right?
right.
Although
Well, and the fall of Afghanistan recently, where you believe what you want to. But in this case, it was. And yet along the way there, while Biden was banging that drum loudly for all to hear, he was also slowing the roll on arms shipments to Ukraine, which would have been helpful. But unlike, say, when President Trump slowed down arms sales to Ukraine, which would have been helpful for Ukrainians in defending their nation, President Trump did it to attempt to extort a favor, a political favor. President Biden did it out of concern for a nuclear holocaust. And that is still very much in the offing right now. But that is, part of how we get to where we are, is that promises were made by nations to one another that were not honored. Right. And in the wake of the Crimean invasion, it becomes clear that, we know we guaranteed you that we would do this. We know we have treaties about this, but we're going to look the other way.
Yeah. In a couple of sentences, could you just explain what's Crimea's relationship to Ukraine and Russia, and explain that it's actually a part of Ukraine, right?
It is. Crimea is a strategically important peninsula on the Black Sea in southern Ukraine. And it is where the Soviet nuclear fleet was based. So you've got submarines there, you've got all kinds of naval facilities there. And it is, it is a heavily Russified area. So a lot of Russians have moved there. And that is, I think a part of the history that's important to understand is Russification under the Tsars, under the Soviets, the moving of peoples from one area to another to sort of even things out and get everybody in with a Russian-oriented culture, a culture dominated by Russia. And, in Ukraine, you have, also in the West, you had Polonization from the Poles, you had Magyarization from the Hungarians. So you've got all these people who want you to be part of their people, part of their imperial ambitions, in denial of your own heritage. With Russia, it is more complex because it's a bigger, longer history, and they are, Ukrainians and Russians are both Slavic peoples. But Russification was really heavy in Ukraine, and under Stalin, the Tartars were moved out of Crimea. So the Crimean Tartars are the descendants of Genghis Khan and the Golden Horde, who had ruled Ukraine at one time in the Khanate back in like the 12th century. But Stalin moved wholesale all of these people out of Crimea, moved them to Central Asia, uprooted them from their homes where they'd been living for centuries, and moved a lot of Russians into Crimea. Crimea of course, is famous for the Crimean War, the Charge of the Light Brigade, Florence Nightingale, really much like the American Civil War, one of the first examples of modern warfare, where modern industrial technology is brought to bear on the battlefield, and also where we see war run horribly amok, as it usually does. So the peninsula is this historically, strategically still very important area that Russia annexed simply by saying they wanted to. They sent in Russian army unmarked, not with no insignia, as Russian soldiers, and took over. They claimed, Putin made the claim, internationally, that this was permissible because this was in the wake of this was coming in the wake of the Maidan revolution, the revolution for dignity in Ukraine, which was part of this continual move since the Declaration of Independence in 1990 to the West and to democratic standards, wanting to move away from autocracy. And I think that's something that we've seen.
They tried to play it to the world that these were really Ukrainians, Crimeans, who were taking the land back to Russia.
Right, and that the government in Kiev is not a legitimate government.
That's right.
That the Ukrainian government in the wake of 2014's protests was no longer legitimate, that there had been an illegal coup, and that they therefore had no right to their own national territory. And Putin's argument that they are, Crimea is mainly a Russian-speaking area is, of course, true. That's inarguable. That people might speak a language, the Russian language, as their first language, but not themselves be Russian, is also inarguable, and I think obvious. Unfortunately, for Putin, not that it really matters to him, because again, as the Tsar, he is not concerned with the suffering of the people. But the war he is waging in eastern Ukraine and along the Black Sea, in which he is destroying cities, destroying towns. He is destroying those towns which were, predominantly Russian-speaking places, where if there was any affinity for Russia, that's where he would have found it. In the wake of that, what we've seen is the strengthening of the Ukrainian national identity, and of the cohesion of the nation as a whole. Whether you are east of the Dnieper River or west of the Dnieper River, it is the Ukrainian nation, and it seems to have taken some people by surprise. Like, oh, these Ukrainians, they're mounting this huge defense. They're really fighting for their country.
Yeah.
I think for Ukrainians, it's not a surprise, that this is a people, this is a nation.
Well, I remember in the weeks leading up that there was this notion that it would kind of wind up like Iraq, right? That the Russian military would roll in pretty easily, maybe not take Kiev, but take over the country pretty easily. But then there would be a protracted insurgency, that they would unseat the government, be able to take control, but then there would be this protracted insurgency that could last who knows how long, depending how well funded it would be and the morale. But I think even Putin, as well as all his military advisors, definitely overplayed their hand, right? And that thinking that they could roll in, and that even the population, right, would pretty maybe not, welcome them with open arms as liberators, but they would be a lot more accepting than they have been. That they would just see this as okay, and certainly, and how do you see that sort of this resistance, and that now Russia and Putin is in a war that they didn't really think was going to be this difficult? How do you see that playing out in the next several months? Is that how do you think Putin's going to react, and how do you think things are going to go?
Violently.
Yeah.
I think the reaction will be one of increasing violence. And I think that things will go badly for everyone involved. At the outset of this, my hope was that it would simply end quickly to spare the lives of people. Now I'm somewhat more hopeful that possibly in the wake of this destruction, there could be the downfall of Putin himself. Hopefully that would lead to someone better and something better for the Russian people, and for their neighbors as well. Because, Putin seems to have put himself at much greater risk than he was anticipating by waging this war. But I think he is still learning from the wars that he had waged successfully in the past. Like, I can consolidate power through making war in Chechnya. I can take the land of neighboring states in Georgia, in Ukraine, and nobody's going to tell me that I can't. Nobody's really going to do anything about it internationally. There were sanctions after the Crimean invasion, but they were different than the sanctions that have been levied now. The war that Putin has waged most recently in Syria, where there are two, we saw the United States did not want to get involved, being fatigued by war, particularly in the Middle East. And so there was no direct involvement. And then Putin saw an opportunity to make war, make common cause with an old ally in Syria and fill that vacuum. And there has been a war waged in Syria of complete destruction, where the Assad regime, in order to hold the country, has annihilated their own nation. So I think those are the lessons that Putin has learned, and it's pretty clear in how he's pursued this, how he's prosecuted this war, that's what he's drawing upon. But hopefully, the result will be different, and that whether it is a protracted insurgency, whether it is the military stalemate, which it now seems to be entering, that it will perhaps lead to Putin's downfall. The orientation of, again, the sociology of warfare within Russia has been one of autocracy, and it's in real contrast to Ukraine, which has moved towards greater democracy. These have been, painful movements in that direction, with the Orange Revolution, the Revolution for Dignity on the Maidan, where Ukrainians have opted to move in a more democratic direction. President Zelensky was elected on an anti-corruption platform, which, overnight did Ukraine go from being what is rated as the third most corrupt nation on earth, Russia being the first, to being like, no, transparent and free of corruption. No, but the very election of somebody who wanted to move in that direction is significant. And it is a very different move than that, the move towards openness, the move towards transparency, towards, having institutional norms serving the people of the nation is very different than what's been happening in Russia. I think that what we've seen in Russia is Putin clamping down on the press, on the judiciary, on opposition political parties, so as to, create his own imperium within the country. And now he's attempting to expand it outside of the country. And while the relationship, the history between Russia and Ukraine is a long and involved one, I don't think for a moment that if this war were successful, it will stop with Ukraine. And I think that the Lithuanians are very aware of that. The Poles are very aware of it. The Georgians are certainly aware of it. The Finns have always been aware of it. So it's, that war can keep going because that empire in his mind covers all of these places.
Yes. Yes, no doubt. Well, okay. I think we're going to have to wrap it up there on that dark note, unfortunately. But we're going to have to do part two.
Yeah.
I think. Yes. So maybe in April, in a couple of weeks, we can revisit. Hopefully we'll be, let's hope that we're talking about things in a more, around more positive developments for Ukraine. And
we can talk sanctions regimes,
yes,
like you had mentioned beforehand, because I think what we have here is something very different going on.
Yeah.
Sanctions, I'm often skeptical of how well they work, this idea of this soft power. But I recognize that there are different sanctions in different situations. And while some, against Cuba, have kept a neighboring country of ours mired in a situation and enabled the Castro regime to remain in power, others, against divestment in South Africa in the 1980s, ushered in a new era for that country.
Right.
So that there are different things, and what we're seeing now really is unprecedented.
It sure is.
And it's not really about punishing the Russian people, though obviously it's having that effect. It's not about, breaking up Putin's
it might just
oligarchy,
constrain their ability to wage the war,
bankrupting a $20 billion a day war machine.
Right. Right. Like, unfortunately, we've kept Cuba in abject poverty for so long, but certainly, this is a different situation because Cuba was not at war with anyone, right?
Yeah.
And so this, will definitely affect, hopefully. I mean, it is unprecedented. We'll see. And the way that the European Union was able to come together for this is really, really interesting. We hope that China and countries in Africa who are in much need of oil, that they don't provide a pipeline, literally and figuratively, for Russian gas and oil. And another thing I want to address in our second part is how this might affect any potential global action on climate change. I mean, it's sort of like, it's just, are we just doomed? Anyway, I hate to end
Hopefully it will hasten us to get off of oil.
That's what we would think, right? I mean, it's kind of an opportunity, especially in Europe, right? And here, right? As happened in 2008, there was an opportunity. We saw Americans buying smaller, more gas-efficient cars, right? That went out the window
for like a year.
Yeah, for like a year, exactly. But it's an opportunity, Let's use this. Let's just revamp the whole system, right? Anyway, all right. Well, my friend, thank you so much. We will continue this conversation.
Put it in the hopper, edit it together. Let me know what you get out of it.